Welcome to the Adventures of Alice and Bob, the podcast where we get root access to the people shaping the world of cybersecurity today to find out a little bit about their journey, the events that have helped shape their career, and those things that still keep them up at night. Today, we're joined by Aaron Portnoy, a cybersecurity veteran with over 20 years' experience, and a man who's been instrumental in shaping the modern vulnerability research landscape. Currently serving as head of research and innovation at MindGuard and as a hacker fellow and fellow hacker at Dartmouth College, Aaron is probably best known as the founder and original organizer of Pwn2Own, the world's premier hacking competition that began as a humble contest with a laptop prize and has now evolved into an international event and millions of dollars in prizes over the years. Aaron's journey began as a teenager on IRC, mentored by some anonymous figures. I feel like we should add shadowy to that as well, who introduced him to the world of vulnerability research. From his early days at the Zero Day Initiative, where he became the youngest manager and created Pwn2Own, to co-founding Exodus Intelligence, which featured on the cover of Time magazine. Aaron has been at the forefront of major developments in cybersecurity. His story includes all sorts of interesting meetings with legendary figures like H.D. Moore, Matt Miller, and exploits in where he's been debugging flash exploits with styluses on tablets, whilst also navigating the complex ethics of zero-day markets. So Aaron, welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And I think there's a defining thing we're discovering with our guests on, in the real world, you have boomers and Gen X and Gen Z and Gen Y. On our cybersecurity podcast, we have people who started like Mark on BBS systems and people like me and you who started on IRC systems.
Look at James calling me old, straight out the gates, dude. The abuse.
It's a way of saying boomer without saying boomer. And but I'm interested, Aaron, I mentioned IRC there. Where did your journey with technology start and how did that lead you into IRC and the kind of the path you've gone down there?
Yeah, IRC was definitely the first hacker-ish kind of environment that I joined. I would say all this started because my stepfather was a network install kind of technician, climbing poles and running T1 lines, DSL back in the day. And he would buy me any technical book that I wanted within limits. So he had some techie friends at his work who suggested that I install FreeBSD. And this was back when I was running Windows 3.1. And I thought FreeBSD was an application. I thought it was something you install on top of Windows. So, 14 floppy disks later, whatever it took to install that, I found myself at a prompt and had to figure out how to then use my computer. Trial by fire, figured out how to use Unix operating systems, figured out how to use IRC, ended up on IRC. And the community back then was very anonymous, but quite helpful, willing to kind of feed what was insatiable at the time, my curiosity. And I just had a very high drive to figure out how things worked. And on a computer, when you do that, you end up pretty close to the metal. You end up in some interesting places on the internet. I always say, parents tell you not to talk to strangers on the internet. Had I not done that, I would not be here. IRC was the gateway drug, I guess, at the time into the hacking space.
And did you like when you first got on IRC, were you already have kind of an awareness of kind of hacking and that kind of security as like a thing that you were kind of seeking out, or did you like kind of stumble into it, or like how did you actually make that connection?
I wish I could remember with better fidelity exactly what micro steps I took to get there, but I think it was just general technology. I have vague memories of learning. I think my first programming language was QBasic, maybe. And I was into like 3D modeling and things like that at the time. And that was I was interested in game development. So I learned BASIC, I learned how to code in that. So I think I probably started in IRC looking at, more like programming specific channels and so forth. And then I'm sure, I can't remember what it was, but I'm sure there was something I was like, wow, that's really cool. That looks like a magic trick, security related, like interesting little thing. And that, follow the breadcrumbs, you end up in, all sorts of pound random sketchy channels with people who are actually operating and doing, at the time, things they probably should not have been talking about in a public setting.
And the kind of the theme that runs through a lot of your career there, that kind of gamification of vulnerability research, the stuff we later see in Pwn2Own. Did some of that begin with competing with other people on these IRC channels, getting involved with activities there?
That's a good question. I have to choose what to talk about. certain things I probably shouldn't mention, but I will say there was one, I will say, instrumental individual who, this came full circle later in my career, but I met someone, I didn't know their name for decades, but I met this person on IRC. They were a professional in the field, probably 8-10 years older than me. And they were doing I'll just say it, they were doing illegal things on the internet, and they were good at it. So they were applying their professional expertise against things they shouldn't have. And he sort of took me under his wing because, he saw something interesting in what I was asking. And he started to show me things, I'll leave it there. He showed me things which were very interesting. And he played a game with his friends in which they would randomly choose a net block or an IP range on the internet, usually a foreign one, and they would set a timer. And it's like racing for pink slips with cars. They said whoever hacked the most hosts on that net block would get the other person's laptop, which was wild to me because I couldn't even afford a laptop. And he ended up sending me a Sony Vaio and an Orinoco Wi-Fi card and a pigtail, which would very much confuse my parents, given that we definitely couldn't afford a laptop, never mind a Sony Vaio. But that was like the first kind of, I guess, gamification of security for me was like actual, real being exposed to it. I was not doing it myself, but he was hacking a lot of stuff he shouldn't have. And if you think forward to the Pwn2Own contest, you can see kind of the analogy there. It was hack the thing, get a laptop. So that was probably my first exposure to that.
And what was the reaction from your parents having told you not to talk to strangers on the internet then when they discover a top of the range laptop appears at the house? I mean, it's probably better than you losing and having to ship your desktop off to someone.
Yeah. The shipping cost on those bricks back in the day would have been substantial. Yeah, it was definitely one of surprise. Luckily, my parents trusted me from a young age and kind of just went with the flow. I mean, they trusted me on a lot of things, including every time they'd ask me to go bag groceries to pull in some money. And I said, no, leave me alone in this room until 3 a.m. typing on a black screen. They kind of trusted my judgment. So they were absolutely surprised. They didn't ask too many questions. And I think they got conditioned through a number of other things we could talk about as far as surprises that showed up at the house, that was going to be a thing that they just had to deal with.
Dare we ask what other things showed up at your house at points?
Well, the IRS for one. Yeah, I had no concept of taxes when I was younger, and I did a bunch of bug bounty. This was back before real bug bounties, before the ZDI, and I made some money, didn't understand the whole tax situation, and ended up in a bit of a pickle.
Usually when there's like the federal somebody showing up, like when we're interviewing somebody and they're like, federal whatever, it's usually like the FBI, illegally break it in. You're like, oh yeah, I was already doing bug bounties, crushing it, just forgot to pay taxes. I freaking love it.
Well, that's the next one I was going to tell. Next story is that if you read the Time Magazine article, they're basically just doing a little dive into my history. And I got in some trouble in my high school days. I went to a K through 12 public high school in Massachusetts, graduating class 38 kids, quite small. But for the last 2 years of high school, most of the last of the second year, I went to the Massachusetts Academy of Mathematics and Science at WPI, Worcester Polytechnic Institute. So it's a public school. They let 50 kids in a year, sponsored by the university. And so I hacked the university, got in trouble. FBI came and got kicked out, sort of. I left because the ultimatum they gave me was not favorable. But yeah, no, I have that story too. Couple of those stories.
That's fantastic. I think you've got something in common with Al Capone, because I think Al Capone was caught by the IRS first. They couldn't pin anything on him from a law enforcement until it was the IRS. So you've got that in common there.
Yeah, don't mess with the IRS.
Fantastic. So you mentioned that you were doing, as well as these like fun competitions and winning laptops for possibly nefarious activities, you were actually doing some bug bounty work as well before it was an established industry. How did you come to be involved in those more professional engagements? Was that through the IRC channels and the mentors you had?
How was that done? Honestly, I don't recall. I think I was just so interested in, and this has been a bit of a theme through my entire career, is, there's a spectrum of people who work in this space. I always kind of went to the left side in terms of I wanted to find the things nobody had found before. It was more interesting to me than using tools or using vulnerabilities others had found or building tools on top of it. Not that I don't do that, but like the idea of having a particular, it's more interesting to me, the puzzle of finding a zero-day vulnerability than using it. It's almost like, this is a stupid analogy, but if you think James Bond, like Q and James Bond, I was more on the Q side. Like I like to go find a cool thing, solve the puzzle, and then I don't care about it after that point. So early on, finding vulnerabilities, it was a bit of I don't know if this is a complex, but a lot of people in our industry, like I've never referred to myself, or I don't think I have ever, as a hacker. It almost feels like a thing that has to be bestowed upon you by someone you respect more. And to me, the best cred you could get in this space was the zero-day vulnerabilities. It was the black art, the ability to reverse engineer, the ability to find something that only you know about. I don't know if it's a power trip there. I don't think so, because it wasn't really about leveraging it. It was about just finding it. And then, money's nice. So trying to find anyone that would pay me for that, I stumbled upon, I think, the vulnerability contributor program from iDefense. This was pre-VeriSign acquisition. So 2003, 2, somewhere around there.
Do you remember what like your the first vulnerability you found was, or maybe the first that stands out in your mind?
I remember the first thing I found that I thought was a security vulnerability, and I'm still to this day not sure if it was anything useful, and it was so lame, but a D-Link UDP fragmentation denial service. And I didn't have the skills to really nail down exactly what was happening and couldn't really reverse engineer it, but it was fragmented UDP, and it caused a reboot of the D-Link, probably kernel fault of some kind. And I thought it was cool because, it was like, I was on AOL Instant Messenger back in the day, and I remember punters and the idea of like, haha, you said something I don't like, see you later. So being able to do that over the network against someone's router was fun for me, but of course that's not like code execution or anything like that. So, but that was the first one I remember.
Well, that's actually cool. So, what time frame roughly would that have been? Do you know?
2004, 3, probably.
Yeah. I was thinking, it reminded me of like I was trying to think, because there was a period of time where there was like a variety of like denial of service, like fragmentation issues. I remember way back, to date myself, since James already called me old, to start when I had when I was like teenage hacker runaway guy for a year. I was sitting in I think it was the University of Florida or something like that, with Horizon or Humble as the nicknames would go. And I remember when he basically crafted like his first I cannot remember the software, but it was like his first remote code execution. And I remember there's a thing, like to your point, it's like that thrill of like having solved the puzzle. Like there's kind of no better feeling. And so kind of going from that, like maybe first vuln that you're recalling there, like you've obviously had some pretty insane discoveries over the years. Like is there another one that like stands out most, like particularly like in that one where we were like, well, it's like it's vuln definitely is a problem, but like maybe something in the code execution space that you were like, your first like, wait a minute, I'm not just kind of causing a problem for the thing. Like I could be, executing and doing things now fully to the system, I guess.
Yeah. If we're not talking about like the chronologically first, I can speak to the one that I found to be the most fun, which was at my previous role at Randori, which is an attack surface management company. We did continuous automated red teaming. And when I joined the company, we had code names for all of our customers, and there was one called Fort Knox. And it is absolutely a company you all know. It's named Fort Knox because they were very mature from a security posture perspective, limited attack surface, great security ops teams, IR, everything. And prior to my joining, we were unable to breach their perimeter. And that's kind of what we said we were going to do. So it was, one of those situations where it was a very big contract and it was up for renewal and we couldn't break Fort Knox. So I locked myself away in a cave basically for 2 months and reverse engineered Palo Alto firewall and found a 0-day, well, I think it's 2, Palo still thinks it's 1, but it was a default configuration, HTTP smuggling, and Stack Overflow, straight up stir copy. And the bug itself, and I mean, I'm surprised it was there. Like, you can grep for stir copy and fix it. But the exploit, and to this day, I don't think anyone's exploited it yet. I saw an exploit on GitHub, but they did it with ASLR off, which is cheating because we didn't have a leak. So we exploited this thing with full ASLR, Stack Overflow, over the internet, and landed a shell on their firewall, and then proceeded to run rampant on their internal network and use a bunch of other ODA we had. But I could talk about the mechanics of that vulnerability for days, but it was basically bypassing all sorts of rate limiting, going through a HA proxy in the cloud to fire 250. It took 6 hours to run. 256-ish thread, different connections.
6 hours to run just for the kind of getting stuff to the right state.
Yes, because
we have like for whatever level you want to go to, we have like a broad spectrum of folks that listen. Some that might just be more newer to InfoSec or general, or never really kind of gotten in the weeds of vulnerability research. Like, you think you want to kind of like dive in deeper there? I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand like the kind of aspect of like, I think they think of the exploit as this kind of single shot immediate thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Very much.
Is the ones that typically get highlighted, and certainly the ones that Hollywood highlights. But for whatever level you remember or you want to go into, I think would be cool.
Okay. So you've got all sorts of classes of vulnerabilities. You have the very reliable ones, command injection, in which you're just saying, hey, tack on this extra command that's going to run on the host. Easy. And you have memory corruption. Memory corruption, notoriously extremely difficult depending on mitigations for a lot of reasons. Stack overflows, heap overflows, memory management, all sorts of different problems. This one was a stack overflow on a system that was randomizing all of the memory space in its process space. So overflowing a buffer on the stack, your goal is to overwrite usually the return address, sometimes other things. And you don't have to overwrite that with an actual value that is a valid memory address. Now, if you don't know, because all the memory addresses are randomized, if you can't be on that system ahead of time and you don't know what it could be, you're in a bit of a predicament where you can cause it to crash. But if you want to actually hijack the control flow in a useful way, usually you need to implement a leak. So you need to do something that like gives you back some insight. So you do like a micro exploitation and you might get back some data. We didn't have that luxury. So we had to do something which was significantly more complex. And I cannot even in the hour we have here, really walk through everything that it did. But I'll give you a high level picture of it's because this was a multi-threaded firewall, it would allocate different stacks for different connections. So we ended up with a cloud infrastructure that we set up that would throw the attack at the target using 256 different client connections, none of which were throwing an exploit until the very last one. So 255 of them that were doing the setup. And this is why it took 6 hours. And also because other users were using the firewall at that time. So of course we did it at like 3 a.m. But it was essentially filling up the stack and one byte by byte. So when you fill up the stack with a string, it gets a null appended to it, right? Strings are null terminated. So you can effectively zero out a stack from the bottom up or whatever way you want to look at the stack by sending a request of a certain length and then sending a request of that length -1 and -1 and -1. And eventually you end up like filling up the stack with nulls. So we're using various techniques like that to essentially fragment the stack into a position in which we could surgically overwrite the least significant byte. So when you think of like an address as a number, a hexadecimal number, most significant being the largest, if your place in the numbers, and then the least significant being the lowest. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then thousands, hundreds, and so forth on the other side. Addresses if you basically, if you can overwrite and change or null out some of the lower bytes, you're just kind of shifting where that address is. And so we use kind of what I'm describing here to overwrite a pointer that was a return address such that it changed its address space to be relatively different than what it was into our buffer. And then we did a slide, what's called a slide, into our actual payload. It's kind of difficult to explain without a whiteboard, to be honest, but we tried it twice and it landed the second time. Took 6 hours and it texted us at some ungodly hour. We had our exploit had a little SMS hookup to it. So it was one of those things where we're like, all right, I hope this works. See you guys later. Hit enter. And we all clocked out for the day. And then, at whatever time in the morning, we all got a text message. We all hop on the chat. We're like, oh my God, did it actually land? And there we are with a shell on a firewall, which
you kind of, I didn't understand about the whiteboard or whatever, but it's one of the things I love about you, dude, and that for years now is like, you're literally one of the most, I think technical, just say kick-ass people in our field. And I think the hardest thing to do is to take stuff like what you're talking about and explain that out to people. And I thought that was a great, I'm sure we'll get questions involved, but like, really appreciate that. Cause I think it's cool for people to kind of hear some of the underworkings. And you mentioned, and I don't know if it's relevant here, but so this might be a thread I'm pulling on that's not one, but you mentioned about the doing it at 3 a.m. and I assume that was something because of like how you guys were trying to get things set up. Like it wasn't kind of, I don't know, specific to some identifier or something that you would control, like other load on the system from other users was somehow in the mix. Is that so?
Yeah.
How much was that? Like, I guess a factor, like the environmental side, like on the customer that you were, yeah.
We very much needed the stack to be exactly in the state that we thought it was going to be in without any introspection into its current state. So we were doing it basically blind, and any user that connected to the VPN while we were doing that could completely reset our process and we'd have no idea. And our process took hours and hours and hours. So a single user could log in and we would not know, and we had no feedback loop whatsoever. So it's like trying to solve a math equation and someone just throws in a random constant and you don't know. Like, you're like, why did it not work? I don't know. I didn't see that. So yeah, it was definitely, I would call that environmental or influenced by other factors that we could not control or observe in any way.
Means, motive, and opportunity. Yeah. All coming together.
That's awesome.
You mentioned that with that particular exploit, you're working at a company and you had some high profile clients and you had the luxury to be able to lock yourself effectively in a bunker and deal with this firewall and reverse engineer it and work out all this stuff for 2 months. But your journey in your earlier career wasn't always quite that easy. I believe when you worked at iDefense in Reston, Virginia, you didn't even have an easy commute to get to the office, let alone anything else. Could you describe how that started off?
Yeah. I had a summer free and I really wanted to get into the industry professionally. So I remember searching for internships, just searching security related internships. And I found a few, and I found mostly historical examples at the time of companies that were doing that. And I put together a little cover letter, emails to everyone, individuals that I could find there. And I said, hey, I saw you had an internship. I'm willing to work for free. I just want to get in the space. Like, I'm super motivated. Here's what I know. Really, I would have worked for free for any of them. And 2 folks got back to me, Matt Wachinski at SourceFire and Sunil James at iDefense. He's over at Bessemer, I think now. But yeah, so they both reached out. The SourceFire opportunity was a Perl developer. So SourceFire being the intrusion prevention system, it was written in Perl, and they were offering me some, I think it was like a $20, no, it must have been less than that. It was $20, $15 an hour. So it was something that sounded great, but it was Perl development and Perl. And then the other one was iDefense, which was vulnerability focused. It was less money, but way more interesting. So I ended up going with iDefense. I moved out to East Falls Church, Virginia. And yeah, the commute wasn't great to get to Reston because I didn't have a car. So I ended up having to walk a mile from where I was staying to a bus station to take the Fairfax I took a subway from the East Falls Church to the West Falls Church station. Then I took the Fairfax connector from there to Reston to a stop, and then had to walk the last leg to iDefense's building to get there for like 8 o'clock or whatever it was. So I was up, stupid early in the morning every day, but I would print out frac articles and using their printer, of course, reams of paper, and just sit there on the bus and read frac articles. So it's a good use of time, but yeah, definitely had a journey to get there.
And as well as enduring that commute and sensibly avoiding having to code in Perl, you also unlocked some new opportunities there, because I believe you ended up at Rich Johnson's birthday party and even bumped into some of the previous guests on our podcast, namely HD Moore, who might have had a bottle of Dom Perignon and a box of cigars with him.
That was a great memory, and also a little bit of a kind of meeting your heroes kind of moment. And it opened up a lot of, firstly, I met a lot of cool people. So I'll mention Rich Johnson first. Rich kind of being, you mentioned like the various generations. I would say he would be maybe BBS era, I guess. And he was running their vulnerability contributor program at the time. Learned a lot from him, but he had a birthday party, and I went to it, and I didn't know that his friends were going to be coming in particular HD Moore, who of course Metasploit. I knew HD by reputation, but had not met him in person. And yeah, he did show up with one of those Magnum bottles of Dom. So I was a teenager or whatever, and I'm saying HD Moore, like the first people I'm meeting in the industry outside of just the folks at iDefense or people on IRC was HD Moore. And then Matt Miller, who keeps a pretty low profile, but you might know him as Scape, also instrumental in not only Metasploit, but a lot of the interesting security work that goes on internally at Microsoft. He's been there for ages now. Super nice, super sharp guy. Yeah, that was a fun experience. I remember they had a noise complaint. The police showed up, and I had to hide in a closet because I was underage. Also a good memory. But yeah, at that point, I got access to other online environments and communities that I wouldn't have otherwise had access to, and I stay in touch with those guys to this day, and met a lot of really interesting folks from the, if your listeners know, the Metasploit crew, of course, and then No Login crew, if you remember uninformed.org, which was No Login Uninformed. There's a lot of interesting folks that were involved in those communities.
Fantastic. And from that connections, did that lead to career and job opportunities, with those people you bonded with, or was that just a purely like a social adventure? You got to meet some of your heroes and connect with them?
I don't think it materialized into any, I'm sure I could have pursued professional like job opportunities through that community, but really it was more about having extremely smart, talented, willing folks to bounce ideas off of, to see what they were working on, to run into at conferences, and just establish kind of, I guess, professional lifelong relationships. And it couldn't speak more highly of those folks. They're just great people and have done amazing things. You said you've already spoken to HD, so you all know this already. But just being close to them was just really great for my career and for my intellectual curiosity.
Absolutely. The energy that HD gives off is just he's just one of those guests where it just feels like you're being mentally downloaded to as you're listening, because he's got so much information in him to share, and it's such an interesting guy to talk to, and many of the others you mentioned as well there. So such interesting things. How did you then go on? So you've done this internship, you've met some of the stars of InfoSight, you've kind of already been doing bug bounties. How did this lead to becoming part of the 0 Day initiative, and then becoming known for Pwn2Own as well?
Yeah. So while I was at iDefense, I met a number of other folks who I stayed in. Actually, yes. So I met Pedram was my boss over there, Pedram Meany. He, his boss, Dave Endler, was there. And the vulnerability contributor program that iDefense ran was probably one of the first bug bounty programs, if you don't count like Netscape's Browser One and some other random ones that were small time and focused on only their products at the time. iDefense had a threat intelligence product essentially, and that's what they were doing, was buying vulnerability information from external researchers. And Peter and Dave went and started the ZDI in 2005. I tried out college for one semester after iDefense, decided it wasn't for me when my network security professor told me his neighbors were getting on his Wi-Fi access point. So he bought another Wi-Fi access point. Decided I didn't want to stick around there, and ended up down in Austin, Texas at the Zero Day Initiative through Pedram, by basically saying, he offered me a job, or I think it started as he offered me an internship for 6 months, and I was going to go back to college, and he's like, just stick around if you want to. And I did. So I ended up in Texas for a decade, actually, after that.
Fantastic. And then, so you down in Texas, you're part of the Zero Day Initiative there. What was your initial role there? How did you get started? Because I know you had quite a rapid career progression through there, being the youngest manager, but how did it all start for you there?
Yeah, that was probably one of the most useful positions, like from a formative perspective, that I've had in my career, simply because the Zero Day Initiative saw we would accept zero-day vulnerability reports from folks all over the world. So we were just kind of inundated with a bunch of crap, but also some really good vulnerabilities. And it was across a hugely diverse set of targets. So if you go work at like a Microsoft, you're probably mostly seeing vulnerabilities that are in Microsoft code, and that's going to fit into a box of some kind, certain languages, certain technologies. But at the Zero Day Initiative, we didn't have like a set, these are the things you go after that we care about. It was, we're going to judge everything independently, which meant that the task for anyone on the ZDI team was to accept a report of varying quality from an external researcher, get a hold of the software, figure out how it works, figure out if this is a security impact, reverse engineer, like just get deeply familiar with new targets all the time. So I have always been obsessed with the kind of abstract concept of reverse engineering, which I think applies outside of security, but just the idea of it, to me, it's just understanding how something works. And that job let me really lean into that and apply reverse engineering to wildly different things all the time. So I learned how to reverse engineer every language you can think of: hardware, software, mobile, web, native, assembly, C, interpreted languages, Java, all sorts of stuff. And I started as an intern. I ended up on the team as a researcher, and that progression beat from there and onwards was really due to, I reverse engineer pretty quickly. I don't know if that's good or bad. So I'm not like saying, hey, look at me, I'm a good reverse engineer, but I'm very quick at kind of assessing something.
I think a bunch of us would say, yes, you're a very good reverse engineer.
Thank you. So the idea was, I could reverse engineer things really quickly, and I was really obsessed with it to the point where I was, like every Wednesday I was working an all-nighter in the office, and like sleeping at my desk, because I really got obsessed with cracking these things. And that's why when Pwn2Own ended up materializing, I was the one that went out to Vancouver to run it and judge it, was because that contest required verifying the validity of a vulnerability on site in the moment, which you have to be able to do quickly. And so I was the one that was sent out to do that. Of course, that took off and ended up being a whole thing. And then I ended up in the manager position. Pedram went off to start his own little like malware focused company called JumpShot, which he sold to Avast eventually. But on his way out, he, bequeathed upon me the role of manager, and I took that on for a little bit and continued the Pwn2Own and continued also contributing to the team, doing the same kind of work, but it was all focused on reverse engineering things, exploiting things, and Pwn2Own and various other related activities.
How do you think about, man, like there was an interesting like years back, I was on a email group, and I was talking with Dan Gear about like this is like early days of cloud, even just to like super date, and I was pausing that we're entering this like interesting world, especially for security research, right, where we're kind of like going back to the world of like dumb terminals, kind of in the way now that like most people live out of their browser, everything's like running in the cloud somewhere. And from a research perspective, it's interesting because if you think about the, at least the time frame when I was like growing up doing research in like the late 90s, early mid 2000s, etc., there was so much more of IT that was, run on-prem, controlled by the customer, server-side software, client-side software, everything else, right? And the thing I was very worried of, like, in that kind of shift to everything being like, in this magic kind of cloud behind the scenes, is like, it kind of takes away, not that you can't do web-based attacks against web apps and stuff, but there's like a level of like, you can't get the software at some level to reverse engineer, right? And I was curious, just in whatever way you want to take it, but like, how you think about like that kind of shift, right? There's something of, when it used to be the major workloads a business would run would be more likely to be on the server software. We could get it, we could reverse engineer it, we could research it. And I think that's ultimately leads to like a lot better security outcomes, right? Because I think for some of the major kind of cloud platforms and related, surely the intelligence agencies and others, they're in a position to be able to, let's just say, get like deeper access to test things in a way that maybe like an independent researcher today versus 10 years ago, right? And I'm just curious, like, how you think about that shift at all, or any kind of worry there, if that's kind of a thought you've ever had.
Yeah. I think, well, there's a couple of things that come to mind. One, virtualization. Cloud couldn't have happened without it. Therefore, virtualization technologies are always something that, like, you can have things at abstraction layers higher and higher and higher, but at the end of the day, it's going to touch the ones and zeros, the voltages, the metal, the assembly. So like virtualization is always an interesting thing, because even in the cloud, they're using Zen, they're using VMware, they're using all these things that you probably still can get access to. But to your point, you're not hitting the application layer necessarily the same way. So there's that aspect. There's the kind of idea of applying, like, you always have to keep growing in this industry. Like, you could be I only reverse engineer binaries and that's all I'm going to do and I'm not going to change. And I, had that conflict myself at some point. But we have this habit of, we're never going to be able to burn it to the ground and start over with our technology. We always add on cloud or Web 2.0 or random WebAssembly or whatever we're going to keep adding. It just keeps going up and up and up and up. So I found that the coolest vulnerabilities are at the interaction layers between these things, because most people only understand one or two, maybe the one above them, maybe the one below them, but they don't, this is the cool thing hackers do, is that we look at the system. We can zoom out and look at the whole thing and find really interesting side channels and various interactions and things that others who are myopically focused on their layer just don't understand how they work. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to apply the same abstract concept of reverse engineering to cloud-based things, and you end up with different signals and different inputs and different outputs, but you're still doing the same process of, I always refer to the game Minesweeper. That's because it's how I think about it. It's like playing Minesweeper. You're like, what is that? What is that? Oh, and then it opens up a whole new area. You're like, oh, interesting. New view. Let me take that into account. And you can apply that to all the cloud-based and all the web, whatever, browser-based type stuff. And then the other thing I want to call out is, you notice I have the server rack behind me. That is there specifically because at Randori, we were looking at all the CISA KEV, if you remember those, the CISA known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, in which they were keeping track of all the things that real attackers were exploiting. A lot of those targets were hardware. And we were committing to our customers that we would have exploits for everything that was in KEV. And I ended up hosting the satellite Randori lab out of my home, where I was acquiring we called it the ARC because we always got two of any device we had, because inevitably we would brick one. So this was our ARC, and in that there was everything from ruckus wireless access points to switches to tablets to like just a massive amount of hardware devices, in which some of those are Android based, some of those are Windows CE, some of those are, completely real-time operating systems. Those are very similar. Like we had the whole, IoT kind of development where your fridge can talk to the internet, et cetera. All that stuff's not going to be yes, it may talk to the cloud, but if you still want to go and do reverse engineering on a thing where you're looking at, ARM or RISC architectures or x86, what have you, that's going to continue to live on. I've got a random drone over here that's probably running that kind of stuff. Shoots all the stuff that can't easily be put up in a cloud, or that you're going to need your hands on. Your mobile device is another great example. I think there's still a lot of space. So I guess don't disagree with what you're saying in terms of like the move of all this stuff to cloud. I think that has implications for people that want to break it. I think it also has implications for like data privacy, where it goes, what you control. It also has implications for like the homogeneous nature of that type of stuff. Once you get into these like mono environment situations or hyperscaler situations.
Yeah,
so having Cloudflare the other day.
If Dan Gear thought Windows was a monoculture back in the day. I mean,
yeah. I mean, the nice example I think that people bring up, I think Gruck brought this up, of like, what's more secure, Android or iPhone? Well, most people would say, oh, iPhone's more secure. Why? Because they invest in like proper segmentations. The SEER team, like they're doing a hell of a lot of platform work to do that. Android is an absolute, I don't want to cuss on the program, but a mess. It's all over the place. It's all sorts of Linux variations, vendors in the way of people actually shipping fixes, and it's a complete mess. But if I write an exploit that works against an iPhone, it works against every iPhone. If I write an exploit that works against an Android, like maybe it works on this one, maybe it works on that one. Like there's different like risk profiles, and I think the same thing can apply to kind of cloud architecture as well. You saw like the Cloudflare outage that happened the other day. You end up in a situation where you have like different, interesting, maybe even larger impacts because everyone is kind of centering themselves on a particular solution.
Let me ask you, I definitely would chat with you AI here in a second, but to some of what you were saying with on the kind of hardware side of things, I mean, that all seems, to your point, like live and well. I think in the story that you gave earlier about Palo Alto, there's even, recent versions of things, let's just say. Can you maybe walk through just at like a high level for folks listening of like, when I think of the kind of days of originally getting into hardware hacking, I was fond of telling the story of being with the late great Barnaby Jack, and we were presenting at the NSA, and he had a very cool exploit for D-Link, if my cobweb memory is not getting me wrong. But it was for D-Link, and the payload was particularly interesting because it would end up being that anybody behind the D-Link router, it would be like 1 in 10 executables that would be getting downloaded through it. He would essentially patch the binary so that he could try to backdoor the systems behind the router, which was awesome. I think my new presentation at the same NSA thing that we were doing was around, at the time, McAfee's new kind of anti-memory protection stuff on the endpoint, which was very fun to present bypassing that, and the DoD had just done like a DoD-wide contract. But that IoT kind of space, like nothing slowing down there. There's still so many more devices. I mean, we see it as a company all the time, just like the explosion and stuff happening in like the OT space and everything else. It's like, what's the general process of like, you got the rack back there, you get one of these black boxes. There's many approaches to how you might start pulling it apart, whether it's like, getting the firmware from online that you can maybe load up and start dissecting, other things where you might be doing like, I don't know, hardware JTAG to get in there. Like maybe walk through just like high level, like a couple of examples just for people of like, how do you go about trying to find something like that in one of these devices? I think would be cool to walk through.
Yeah. Well, I'll speak to a recent thing that happened. So I help out up at Dartmouth College, and I helped kickstart a user, like a student group there, like a CTF kind of called Hanover Flow, because they're in Hanover. And I wanted to, I like hands-on, non-contrived stuff. I've always kind of had an aversion to CTFs that are not real, because I feel like it teaches the wrong practices. I'm not going to harp on that, and I also don't want to fight about it. So, but I like real world stuff. So what I did with that group is the first exercise. Okay. But so what I wanted to do with the students there, and a bunch of undergrads who didn't have a ton of security experience, is I wanted to make it real for them. So we got in a classroom at Dartmouth, and I said, what do you guys want to hack on? And, random ideas came out. And then I was like, what about, just took a look around and that thing. And it was a tablet on the wall. It controlled the AV system for the room, like drop down the projector, change the lights, that kind of thing. And so, again, I want to start actually this by saying I am not a hardware expert by any stretch. I did not go to college. I don't have the EE background. There's a lot of like targeted knowledge I have, or very like specific. If I need to know something, I will go learn it. That's kind of the superpower of hackers, is like, I will become an expert on this thing really fast. But then you end up missing like the general knowledge. So people might be able to point out flaws in my methodology quite easily. But what we did was we went to their IT department and asked for all the duds they had for these things. And they gave us a box of these. And reverse engineering 101, I wanted to understand, or hardware reverse engineering 101, I wanted to take it apart and look at it. So pop it off, pop the cover off, and look at the actual hardware. Really what we're looking for is what board is on there. Are there daughter boards that are like attached to it? What are the markings on this? And it turns out in the US that we have this FCC thing. And if you're going to start sending stuff over the airwaves in the US, you need to file some paperwork with the FCC about what your device is and get some specs and blueprints, et cetera. So that's usually the first thing I'm looking for, is the FCC filing. So I'll look at the board, try to see if there's any identifying information on it, and then go look on the FCC filings and see if I can find like any more documentation from the vendor. And that starts to tell you things like, okay, it might be using this particular CPU. It might have this type of antenna. And eventually, really what you're looking at is, first, I want to understand the components, like CPU and communication methods it might have. Really, this is an attack surface exercise. And then I want to get introspection on the device. So introspection being like, I want to see how it works. I'd love to be able to see how it works while it's running. So this applies to both software and hardware and many other things. But with hardware, you're looking for actual physical ability to hook up to the thing, so that when you boot the device that you're looking at, you can have it hooked up to a computer and actually see its boot process and see what it's like, some text on a console screen. So that usually materializes through JTAG or UART or other serial related connection points in which you are soldering onto pads that you identified. So just getting the pattern recognition to understand what might be a debug pad on a board. Sometimes they're protected, sometimes they're not. And there are very advanced protection mechanisms from that stuff, from hardware debugging, and then there's simple ones. Luckily, this was not protected in any way, so we were able to solder on a couple wires to it, hook it up to a console, boot it up, and then you start to get a sense of its boot process, and you start seeing, oh, there's a vendor name, oh, there's a memory address, oh, there's whatever related to like the software that is running to for the system. So then you end up with usually something like, okay, I know it's an ARM Cortex CPU. I know it's using this bootloader. I know it's using perhaps this operating system. And then from there, I think in this device for Dartmouth, it was a Android-based operating system with some custom stuff on it. But we were able, because it's Android and it's open source, so I showed them, okay, here's where you get the Android source code. All right, let's put that on a system on our laptop over here or server, and then let's exfiltrate the file system off of this device and diff them. And that's really what we did. Was we had a stock vanilla Android of the same version, and then we had the file system that we pulled off of this little tablet, and then we could start to figure out, okay, what did they change? What did they add? We ended up with a bunch of APKs, which are just packaged up Android applications. Then I showed them how to rip those apart and kind of decompress them, and then notice that it's all Java, and then teach them about Java decompilation, which gets you back to Java source code, and then how to audit the source code for interesting things. And what we're really looking for, any way that we as a user sitting on the same network as one of these devices, if it's in the wall over there, can we talk to this thing? What data of ours, what is the attack surface? What knobs can we turn, switches can we flip, etc. And we ended up with, we also put this on a controlled environment network, and then sniffed the traffic, and we booted it up. So we had the network traffic, we had the file system, we had some of the source code. We noticed on the network traffic that it was reaching out to a particular host on the network. sure what's like a provisioning host of some kind to probably pull down updates. And that's what it was. So we saw how that was working. We found out where that came from on the file system from a config file. We looked into the Java code. We saw how that worked. And then we realized that we could do a DNS kind of man in the middle, swap the host out because it was using HTTP, not HTTPS. So I showed them how to do a man in the middle where, we turn on this device, it tries to pull down, it checks the Dartmouth server to see if it can pull down an update. We sit in between that connection. We say, hey, no, we're definitely the update server. You should take this file from us. That allowed us to essentially get execution on the device because it pull down code and configuration data. And, pop a little screen on there with our nice little hand overflow logo and kind of show the students like, okay, that's the attack surface for it. We found an interesting little capability. And of course, then they wanted to know how to go hack all the vending machines because students. But we, the idea of showing them like hands-on, here's the thing, we're just going to figure it out. I don't know anything about this. I didn't prepare anything. I'm just going to show you how I do it. And in that process, give them the confidence that they can do it too by kind of letting them take over pieces of it, ask leading questions, etc.
It's just such a fantastic approach to education rather than just going like, follow this arbitrary task, steps 1 to 3 of like, what are the questions that I ask? What are the things that I'm thinking about to go through this process with any device? I just think it's a really nice way to teach them and teach them to hack vending machines and maybe get a free laptop off a stranger on the internet someday.
Yeah, the grad students liked that one. They were interested for sure in the vending machine.
And aside from your work at the college as well, what other things are you involved in? I know we said at the start you were running some research, I believe, around AI red teaming.
Yeah, I was at IBM for a little while after we got acquired, and then this summer decided that I have a history of trying to add to my tool belt all the things that exist so that I could hack them. I've worked in the cleared government space doing things I would never have access to hack. Outside of that, I've done mobile. I've done all the stuff I mentioned at ZDI, Azure Initiative. AI being the new thing, I was really interested in how to hack it. When with the AI boom and transformers coming out and all this stuff, I saw that there's this like bifurcation of folks like myself and what direction they were going. Either they were going, how do I use AI to do hacks, or how do I hack AI itself? And I consciously made the decision to go hack AI itself because it wasn't as same puzzle mentality. Like I can see the end of the road in terms of optimizing what I already know how to do. I don't think there's a lot of like greenfield interesting stuff. I'm sorry, there is a lot of interesting stuff there. I'm not interested in optimizing something to do it better using AI. I think I can see to the end of that problem. Looking at AI itself, and I think it's a continent of greenfields. Like there's so many other new innovations to both from an attack and a defense perspective. So yeah, I joined MindGuard, which is a company that started out in the UK, and we do automated red teaming and a little bit into the defensive space. So we help customers who are deploying production AI systems and applications to get a sense of what an attacker would see, what they go after. And our focus is really surfacing the interesting vulnerabilities, because I think a lot of folks in the AI space are like, how do I make the AI say something harmful about my competitors? And it's like, I don't care how to build meth. I don't care if my AI tells me how to do that. Like that's from a business perspective. I care if, did you get a show on our back end? Like, are you reading our PII and that kind of stuff? So that's really our
internal tools in calling things.
I could tell you some stories with the AI stuff. Yeah.
So from an AI perspective, I love earlier we were talking and you were mentioning my favorite thing in security, which is attack surface. How would you maybe explain, for somebody to kind of think about like the general areas of attack surface for AI? Like we were just kind of joking, MCP tools and stuff like that, but like how might you kind of frame like the attack surface of AI? And I realize that's kind of a broad topic, so however you want to take that.
I'll briefly say that when we talk AI, it's helpful to be more specific in what we want to talk about. So like you have the models themselves, And if you're going after the security of the model itself, it's really mostly about getting it to do things outside of what it's supposed to do or was fine-tuned against trying to do. So jailbreaks and getting it to say bad things or getting it to ignore its system prompt instructions to do other things. The impact, though, really comes at the integration points. And that's when you have a model, because they don't exist in isolation. They're always in a system. So you have a model that you take out, it's in an application. Well, we're going to continue to see the trend where it gets access to more and more and more stuff because that's what a business needs. So MCP, agentic architecture, RAG, vector database, all this stuff, it's going to start getting plugged into all the fun stuff. And what's really interesting to me about AI is if I ask a developer or before AI, if a developer were going to go solve a task, they generally follow the pattern of, here's the problem I want to solve. I'm going to write code that's going to solve that problem. The attack surface is what mistakes they made in doing that well-scoped problem and potentially other stuff they might have included they didn't need to. With AI, it's here's my well-scoped problem, and here's the sum human knowledge of everything that's possibly known, has been known, that's on the internet, and I'm going to connect that together. So it's not a one-to-one problem anymore. It's your attack surface becomes like just endless. It's literally like endless. It's about, it depends how we define attack surface, but essentially there are so many variations of how you can force an AI to do a different thing or get by a different guardrail. And it's at its root, it's because we are not at the level of maturity in which there is proper segmentation, security controls, control over this opaque stochastic thing that you can't inspect what it does. It's a black box to most of these enterprises, and they don't have the technology to understand what it's doing, why it's doing. Even the vendors who make these things don't know half the time why it did a thing. Securing that, there's no other piece of software that I can think of that you would go to an enterprise would be like, oh, you don't understand how it works? You can't control it? Yeah, sure. Plug it into all your sensitive data. But the drive to compete, the drive to do all this AI stuff is causing them to do that anyway.
Definitely happening out there. Yeah.
Yeah.
What you mentioned earlier, so I got to ask, but obviously without naming anything confidential or whatever, but like, what's a couple example of more interesting kind of vulnerabilities, issues, etc., that you've surfaced or seen that you're able to share?
Yeah. So I mean, I'll just talk about the one I found yesterday, which is Google Antigravity came out 2 days, like 30 hours ago, something like that. It's an IDE with AI, and it was the new Gemini 3 model inside it. I found I found an arbitrary code execution vulnerability in it within the first 24 hours of release. We just reported it to Google last night. Persistent code execution on anytime you open the My Malicious repo one time in the tool, and it will then cause any future iteration of running the Antigravity tool to execute code again silently in the background. That's pretty bad. Interesting because it's something that just came out. It took me less than a day to break it. But more interesting from an impact perspective is I went after a public, and we'll blog about this on the MindGuard blog, but I went after a public AI target that was like a chatbot, and it had some tools. And one of them was fetch a URL, and it's meant to fetch a remote URL. However, if you give it a local address or an internal address, it would reject you most of the time, but not if you encoded the IP address as a decimal instead of 127.0.0.1. If you gave 262, whatever that is in decimal, it didn't catch the filter they were using. So this thing was hosted in the cloud. I could then get it to turn its fetch URL and get the contents back on itself. I hit the instance metadata service inside the cloud, got all sorts of fun information, and then started poking around and basically using it as a port scanner for their internal cloud environment. Found, probably shouldn't mention, but specific admin interfaces to things that allowed me to stop local processes, read logs. It just opened the door to like data exfiltration and other fun stuff. I found similar things that lead to full-blown code execution. Like there was one that was executing Python, but you could give it Python bytecode and it couldn't inspect whether it was bad or not because it was bytecode. And
it seems like one of the patterns that I've kind of seen there of where essentially it's interesting because the stuff that you're saying about ultimately leading to like abusing some sort of an API, and so somebody who maybe hasn't dove into some of the AI world and MCP tools and everything else, like some of it can sound similar because it is, but there's an interesting nuance. I'm wondering if you're seeing this, where I've seen a lot of people in the rush to kind of adopt AI in the way that you're talking about, where they'll essentially expose, where ultimately you're exposing access to like an API that like you would never just like hang it off the internet directly, but somehow the developers not necessarily thinking about attack surface in this way. There's like much juicier APIs ultimately that you can kind of get access to in the way that you're describing. And like, I haven't seen a lot of companies like thinking about that, where like, I'm not saying that people don't obviously every day publish web apps with external APIs that you can abuse directly. And obviously that's a thing, but it seems like there's just even more fast and kind of loose behind the scenes happening with some of the APIs, kind of like to what you were talking about. And there's, how do you establish, there's almost like what's happening there with AI is just like a different way to get at that attack surface, but also the attack surface that normally wouldn't just be like thrown up on the internet or exposed. Is that kind of a pattern that you're seeing as people are rushing in some of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the service-oriented architecture of the past and API security generally. But I think the new thing with AI that's quite interesting is it's almost like an insider threat. I have co-opted an AI to do things past the perimeter on my behalf. Like SSRF lets you do that, server-side request forgery, but it's usually like, here's a request, do that one thing. Now I can say, hey, AI, here's my natural language instructions. It's 3 paragraphs long. Go do all this stuff and report back to me when you're done. It's like having an insider threat. Like I've had it, I can't give you the code. Like, there's filters where it's like, I can't give you code. It'll get blocked by a guardrail, but I can ask you to go ahead and write some code in natural language that I'd like you to write and deploy and do. Like you can co-opt it to suborn it to do things that would otherwise be blocked. And that's, I mean, I think there's probably lessons to be learned from insider threat methodologies and so forth, but all of this speaks to really the velocity at which all this stuff is being pushed out and productionized, and the lack of maturity when it comes to any amount of guidance or even OWASP's guidance. I disagree with a lot of it. Like there's just no maturity on frameworks or patterns or tools or code to do this in the right way. So there's just this wide variety of developers going, oh, I'm going to YOLO this and put something together. And then of course security comes later, and usually not in a nice way.
I think to that end, man, we're somebody in this industry a long time, super thankful for all the contributions that you've made over the years, and like going from the early days of reverse engineering and bug finding in that sense to clearly what you're looking at and trying to educate now around AI and bringing what I'd say is that very, very real world. I think you said earlier, you can't call yourself a hacker, somebody else has to. So for whatever that's worth, dude, I think you're one of the great hackers. And it's very cool that you're lending your time and talent to the AI space, man. It's much appreciated, because I think it is that kind of ultimate black box, and we're repeating a lot of the kind of patterns of the past that I think always happens in the kind of rush to new technology. And it's cool that you're out there being on the forefront of it, man.
Appreciate the kind words. Thank you.
And unfortunately, that's all we have time today on the adventures of Alice and Bob. A huge thanks to our guest today, Aaron Portnoy, for sharing his remarkable journey from teenage winner of laptops to hacker. And he is definitely a hacker. We can call him that. Mark definitely says we can. Researcher, reverse engineer, and industry legend. And especially for his latest work, actually uncovering that AI attack surface, which is just the problem that's going to keep on giving for the industry, and something that people really need to get on top of. So we appreciate all the work you're doing to draw attention to that there. As always, thanks to my co-host, Mr. BBS, Mark Mayfrey, super producer Jesse, and the team at Beyond Trust who make this podcast happen. I'm James Maud, and this has been Adventures of Alice and Bob.
Thank you for listening to the Adventures of Alice and Bob. Do you have any stories from the cybersecurity trenches that would make our listeners' jaws drop? If so, we would love to have you on the podcast. Maybe you faced down a ransomware attack with nothing but coffee and determination, discovered a breach in the most unexpected way, or had a pen test go horribly wrong. Whatever your tale, funny, harrowing, or just plain wild, we want to feature you on the show. To share your cybersecurity war stories, email us at booking@merchantsmedia.com.